The castle gates groaned open with the weight of inevitability, and Katherine Jackson stepped through them, knowing her life would never be the same. Behind her, the morning mist clung to the cobblestones like the whispers of every woman who had approached these walls before her, each one turned away by the man they called the Cold Night. Sir Alexander Patel stood in the courtyard, his dark eyes measuring her with the same calculating precision he used to assess threats on the battlefield. Unlike the others who had come seeking his hand in marriage, Catherine carried no dowry chests, wore no silken gowns, bore no family crests. She carried only a worn leather satchel and a determination born from having nothing left to lose. The morning sun caught the frost on his black armor, creating patterns that reminded Catherine of the ice that had formed on her cottage windows during the harsh winter months when she had made her decision. Alexander's reputation preceded him like a shadow cast by candlelight, growing larger and more fearsome with each telling. The Cold Night, they called him, the man who had refused every bride brought to his gates, who had turned away duchesses and merchant daughters alike with the same emotionless dismissal he might give to a servant requesting extra coin. Catherine had heard the stories in the village taverns, whispered by women whose own marriage arrangements had fallen through, spoken in hushed tones by mothers warning their daughters about the futility of approaching the fortress that loomed over their valley like a stone sentinel. Some said he had loved once and been betrayed. Others claimed his heart had been carved from the same stone as his castle walls. The boldest whispered that he was cursed, doomed to live alone until the end of his days. But Catherine had learned that desperation makes philosophers of even the most practical souls, and she had spent many sleepless nights wondering if perhaps the stories were wrong. Perhaps the Cold Night was not cold at all, but simply waiting. Perhaps he had refused every bride not from cruelty, but from wisdom, knowing that marriages built on political convenience and financial gain crumble as easily as autumn leaves beneath a horse's hooves. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. Now let me take you back to where this extraordinary tale truly began 3 months earlier. When Katherine Jackson first heard the name Alexander Patel spoken in her family's modest cottage. The fire in the hearth had burned low that December evening when Catherine's father, Nathan Lee, returned from the village with news that would shatter the careful peace of their small world. Catherine sat mending a tear in her winter cloak, her needle moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned early that nothing could be wasted, nothing discarded if it might still serve a purpose. Her younger sister, Sharon Mitchell, hummed softly as she prepared their evening meal, the simple tune their mother had sung before the fever took her 2 winters past. Nathan's footsteps on the threshold carried a weight that made both women look up from their tasks. His weathered face bore the expression Catherine had learned to dread. The look of a man who had been forced to make choices no father should have to make. He removed his wool cap with hands that trembled slightly, whether from cold or emotion. Catherine could not tell. The debt collectors had come to the village that day, Nathan explained, a voice barely above a whisper. The harsh winter had destroyed crops across 3 counties, and the landlords were calling in obligations that had been deferred through better seasons. Families who had lived on the same land for generations were being turned out into the frozen roads with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The Lee family owed more than they could pay in 3 lifetimes of good harvests. Catherine set down her mending with deliberate care, her mind already racing through possibilities and finding each one more impossible than the last. They could sell everything they owned and still fall short by half. They could flee in the night like refugees, abandoning the only home Sharon had ever known to seek uncertain charity in distant villages. Or Catherine could do what desperate daughters had done since the beginning of time, what her mother had once done when faced with similar circumstances. She could marry. The irony was not lost on Catherine that her mother, Dorothy Reed, had married Nathan Lee for love, a rare luxury in their social station, only to see her daughter face the same impossible choice a generation later. But love was a privilege Catherine could not afford, not with Sharon's future hanging in the balance, not with winter's grip tightening around their small cottage, like the fingers of a miser counting coins. Nathan spoke of the men who might take her as wife, each name falling from his lips like stones dropped into a well. There was Richard Thompson, the blacksmith's son, whose wandering hands and ale-soaked breath made Catherine's skin crawl. John Garcia, the merchant twice her age, who had buried 3 wives already, and looked at Catherine with the calculating gaze of a man appraising livestock. Charles Ramos, the soldier recently returned from the wars, whose eyes held shadows that spoke of things no decent woman should have to endure. Each option felt like a different kind of death, a slow suffocation of everything Catherine had hoped her life might become. She had taught herself to read using her mother's prayer book, had learned numbers by helping her father calculate crop yields and market prices. In secret moments, she had imagined a life where her mind might be valued as much as her ability to bear children and manage a household. Such dreams seemed foolish now, luxuries she could not afford when survival itself hung in the balance. That night, as Sharon slept peacefully beside her, Catherine stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind howling around their cottage like a living thing seeking entry. The sound reminded her of the stories old Karen Morgan told in the village square, tales of the cold knight who lived in the fortress overlooking their valley. Karen spoke of Alexander Patel with a mixture of fear and fascination, describing a man who had inherited vast lands and immense wealth but chose to live in solitude rather than take a wife. The stories painted him as a figure both terrible and tragic, a knight who had earned his reputation in battles across distant kingdoms before returning to claim his inheritance. Some said he was cruel, that he took pleasure in humiliating the women who came seeking his hand. Others whispered that he was mad, driven to isolation by horrors witnessed in war. But a few, the oldest women who remembered his father, spoke of him with something approaching sympathy, suggesting that his refusal to marry stemmed not from cruelty, but from a wound that cut deeper than any sword. Catherine found herself wondering what kind of man would choose loneliness over the comfort of companionship. What sort of pain might drive someone to build walls not just around his castle, but around his heart? The questions followed her into restless dreams, where she walked through empty halls and heard the echo of her own footsteps like a heartbeat counting down to an inevitable end. Morning brought no relief from the weight of impossible choices, only the harsh clarity that comes with dawn's unforgiving light. Catherine rose before Sharon woke and made her way to the small garden behind their cottage, where frost had claimed the last of their winter vegetables. The sight of the blackened plants, twisted and brittle in their neat rows, seemed to mirror the state of her family's prospects. She knelt among the ruined plants and began pulling them from the frozen earth, her hands quickly growing numb from the cold. The work gave her something to focus on besides the conversation she knew must come, the decision that would reshape not just her own future but Sharon's as well. Her sister deserved better than the uncertain charity of distant relatives or the harsh realities of life on the roads as displaced persons. The sound of approaching footsteps made Catherine look up to see Sharon emerging from the cottage, her dark hair still tousled from sleep, her eyes holding the innocent trust of someone who still believed their father would find a way to solve their problems without sacrifice. Catherine felt her heart clench at the sight, knowing that innocence would not survive the coming weeks unchanged. Sharon settled beside her sister among the frost-killed plants, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air as she spoke of plans for spring planting, of seeds they might trade for and improvements they could make to their small plot of land. Her words painted pictures of a future that might never come to pass. And Catherine found herself memorizing every detail of her sister's face, every inflection of her voice, as if she were already saying goodbye. The conversation Catherine had been dreading came that afternoon when Nathan returned from another fruitless visit to the village. The debt collectors had been making rounds to other families, he reported, and the stories they brought back were uniformly grim. The Hendersons had lost their farm and taken to the roads with their 3 young children. The Millers had sold their eldest daughter to a traveling merchant in exchange for forgiveness of half their debt. The Coopers had simply vanished in the night, leaving behind everything they owned rather than face the consequences of their inability to pay. Each tale struck Catherine like a physical blow, driving home the reality that their situation was far from unique. Across the county, families were being torn apart by circumstances beyond their control, by the simple mathematics of survival that reduced human lives to columns of figures in a moneylender's ledger. The knowledge that others suffered the same fate provided no comfort, only the cold certainty that sentiment and fairness held no power against the harsh realities of debt and obligation. Nathan spoke again of the men who might take Catherine as wife, his voice heavy with the knowledge that he was asking his daughter to sacrifice herself for the family's survival. Richard Thompson had sent word through his father that he would consider the match if Catherine's family could provide a modest dowry, a cruel irony given their circumstances. John Garcia had expressed interest, but demanded to inspect Catherine personally before making any commitment, as if she were a mare being considered for breeding. Charles Ramos had not responded to inquiries at all, though rumors suggested he was more interested in the tavern girls who asked no questions and expected no promises. The options felt like doors leading to different chambers of the same prison, each one offering its own particular form of misery. Catherine found herself thinking again of the stories about Alexander Patel, the cold knight who had refused every bride brought to his gates. What would it be like, she wondered, to be turned away by such a man? Would the rejection sting worse than the acceptance of someone like Richard Thompson or John Garcia? The question led to others, each one more dangerous than the last. What if the stories were wrong? What if Alexander Patel's refusal to marry stemmed not from cruelty or madness, but from the same desperate hope that Catherine felt stirring in her own chest? The belief that somewhere in the world there might be something better than the compromises that seemed to define adult life. What if his isolation was not a punishment, but a choice, a refusal to settle for anything less than what his heart truly wanted? Such thoughts felt like blasphemy against the practical wisdom that had governed Catherine's life. The understanding that survival required accepting what was offered rather than reaching for what might be possible. But as she sat in their small cottage that evening, watching Sharon practice her letters by candlelight, while Nathan dozed by the dying fire, Catherine felt something shifting inside her chest. A rebellion against the assumption that her only value lay in her willingness to be bartered away like livestock. The idea came to her slowly, taking shape like morning mist condensing into dew. If she must marry to save her family, why should she limit herself to the men who had been deemed suitable by others? If her fate was to be decided by forces beyond her control, why should she not at least choose the nature of her gamble? Alexander Patel might refuse her as he had refused all the others. But in that refusal, she might find something the other options could never provide. The knowledge that she had reached for something extraordinary, even if her fingers closed on empty air. The decision, once made, brought with it a strange kind of peace. The calm that comes from choosing action over endless contemplation. Catherine spent the following days preparing for a journey that felt both practical and mythical, gathering supplies for the trek to Alexander Patel's fortress, while simultaneously preparing herself for what might be her last act of true agency. She mended her best dress with careful stitches, polished her mother's silver cross until it gleamed, and braided her hair with the same precision she might use to prepare for her own funeral. Sharon noticed the change in her sister's demeanor, the way Catherine moved through their small cottage with the measured grace of someone who had made peace with an irrevocable choice. When questioned, Catherine spoke vaguely of plans to seek work in the larger villages, of opportunities that might exist for a woman with her particular skills. The lies came easily, lubricated by necessity and the knowledge that the truth would only bring Sharon pain she was powerless to prevent. Nathan proved more difficult to deceive, his weathered face showing the skepticism of a man who had learned to read the subtle signs of desperation in others. He watched Catherine with the careful attention of a farmer observing clouds on the horizon, sensing the approach of a storm he could not yet name. When she finally told him of her intention to approach the cold night, his reaction was everything she had expected and feared. The argument that followed was conducted in fierce whispers, both of them conscious of Sharon sleeping in the next room. Nathan spoke of reputation and rumor, of the dozens of women who had approached Alexander Patel's gates only to be turned away with cold courtesy and crushing finality. He painted pictures of the humiliation Catherine would face, the way the story of her rejection would follow her through every village in the county, making her unmarriageable to even the least desirable men. Catherine listened to her father's concerns with the patience of someone who had already considered every objection and found them all insufficient to change her course. She spoke of the alternatives they faced, the slow starvation or swift displacement that awaited them if they continued on their current path. She reminded him of the stories they had heard about other families, the way desperation had driven them to choices that seemed impossible until survival itself hung in the balance. The conversation stretched deep into the night, punctuated by long silences during which both father and daughter contemplated futures too grim to voice aloud. Nathan spoke of his own failures, the poor decisions and unfortunate circumstances that had brought them to this crossroads. Catherine assured him that no blame lay at his feet, that the harsh winter and failed harvests were acts of nature no mortal man could have prevented or prepared for adequately. In the end, it was not argument but exhaustion that brought their discussion to a close. Nathan's shoulders sagged with the weight of accepting that his daughter had inherited his own stubborn determination, the same refusal to surrender that had kept their family together through 2 years of mounting difficulties. He extracted promises from Catherine, small concessions that allowed him to maintain the illusion that he retained some influence over her fate. She would take the old horse for the journey, despite the animal's age and uncertain temperament. She would carry her mother's silver cross as both protection and identification. She would return within 3 days, regardless of the outcome of her petition. Catherine agreed to these terms with the solemnity of someone swearing an oath before battle, knowing that some promises were made to be broken if circumstances demanded it. The silver cross felt warm against her palm as she held it, a tangible connection to the mother who had faced her own impossible choices with grace and dignity. Dorothy Reed had married for love but died in poverty, a cautionary tale about the dangers of following one's heart in a world that valued practical considerations above all else. The morning of Catherine's departure dawned clear and cold, the kind of winter day that made every breath visible and turned the landscape into a crystalline study in black and white. Sharon woke early to help her sister prepare, her movements quick and efficient as she packed provisions and checked the condition of Catherine's traveling clothes. The sisters worked in companionable silence, each lost in thoughts too complex and painful to share. Nathan brought the horse around as the sun climbed higher, the aging mare snorting and stamping in the cold air as if she sensed the significance of the journey ahead. Catherine secured her small bundle of possessions behind the saddle and checked the fastenings with the thoroughness of someone who understood that small oversights could have large consequences. The horse's breath formed clouds in the frigid air, and Catherine found herself wondering if this might be the last time she saw the familiar outlines of their cottage and garden. The goodbye was kept deliberately brief, both sisters understanding that prolonged farewells would only make the separation more difficult to bear. Sharon pressed a small packet of honey cakes into Catherine's hands, the sweet treats they had shared on special occasions now serving as a token of hope for her sister's safe return. Catherine tucked the packet carefully into her cloak, knowing she would treasure each crumb regardless of what lay ahead. The road to Alexander Patel's fortress wound through countryside that grew progressively more desolate as Catherine traveled north. The fertile farmlands of her home valley, giving way to rocky hills and sparse forests that seemed to reflect the reputation of their destination. The horse beneath her moved with the steady patience of an animal accustomed to long journeys, her hooves finding purchase on the frozen ground with careful precision. Catherine found herself grateful for the beast's reliability, understanding that her mission's success might depend on details as mundane as her mount's ability to navigate treacherous terrain. As the miles passed beneath them, Catherine began to encounter other travelers, and their reactions to learning her destination provided a sobering preview of what awaited her at journey's end. A merchant heading south with a wagon full of winter goods crossed himself when she mentioned Alexander Patel's name, muttering prayers under his breath as if the mere mention of the cold night might bring misfortune upon them all. A group of pilgrims traveling to a distant shrine spoke in hushed tones of the fortress that loomed ahead, describing it as a place where hope went to die and dreams were ground to dust beneath the weight of one man's inexplicable cruelty. The stories grew more elaborate and contradictory as Catherine encountered more people, each traveler adding their own embellishments to the legend of the cold night. Some claimed he was hideously scarred from his battles, his face so terrible that no woman could look upon him without fainting. Others whispered that he was unnaturally beautiful, possessed of such perfection that mortal women seemed crude and unworthy by comparison. A few suggested that he was not entirely human, that his mother had lain with some supernatural entity and produced a son who could never find satisfaction with earthly pleasures. Catherine listened to these tales with the skeptical attention of someone who understood how stories grew in the telling, how fear and fascination could transform an ordinary man into a figure of legend. She had seen the same process at work in her own village, where simple events became epic narratives through repetition and embellishment. The truth, she suspected, lay somewhere between the extremes, in the mundane reality of a man who had chosen solitude for reasons that probably made perfect sense to him, even if they seemed incomprehensible to others. The landscape around her began to change as she climbed higher into the hills, the sparse trees giving way to bare rock and patches of snow that had survived in the shadows of boulders and cliff faces. The air grew thinner and colder, carrying scents of pine and stone that spoke of wilderness and isolation. Catherine pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders and urged the horse forward, conscious that daylight was growing shorter and she needed to reach her destination before darkness made travel dangerous. The first glimpse of Alexander Patel's fortress, it came as Catherine crested a ridge and found herself looking down into a valley that seemed carved from the living rock by some ancient cataclysm. The castle rose from the valley floor like a natural formation, its dark stone walls blending so seamlessly with the surrounding cliffs that it seemed less built than grown. Towers reached toward the gray sky like fingers of shadow, and Catherine could see the tiny figures of guards moving along the battlements, their presence the only sign that the fortress housed living beings rather than ghosts. The sight was both more and less impressive than Catherine had expected. Lacking the fairy tale grandeur she had imagined, but possessing a stark beauty that spoke of strength and endurance. This was not a castle built for comfort or display, but a fortress designed to withstand siege and storm, to protect its inhabitants from any threat the world might offer. Catherine found herself wondering what kind of man would choose to live in such a place. What fears or desires might drive someone to surround himself with walls so high and thick. The descent into the valley took longer than Catherine had anticipated, the road winding back and forth across the steep slopes in a series of switchbacks that tested both her patience and her horse's endurance. The sun was beginning to set behind the western peaks when she finally reached the valley floor and found herself approaching the massive gates that guarded the fortress entrance. The iron portcullis was raised, but Catherine could see guards watching her approach from the towers flanking the gateway. The sound of her horse's hooves on the cobblestone courtyard seemed unnaturally loud in the evening stillness, echoing off the stone walls like the beating of an enormous heart. Catherine dismounted with movements made awkward by hours in the saddle and cold that had seeped through her traveling clothes to chill her mana. She stood for a moment beside her horse, gathering courage for what lay ahead, conscious that she was being observed by unseen eyes from the windows and battlements surrounding the courtyard. A servant emerged from a side door, an elderly man whose lined face bore the neutral expression of someone accustomed to receiving unexpected visitors. He took the horse's reins without comment and gestured toward the main entrance, his movements efficient and professional. Catherine followed his silent directions, her footsteps echoing in the vast space as she approached doors that seemed designed to dwarf anyone who passed through them. The great hall of Alexander Patel's fortress stretched before Catherine like a cathedral of stone and shadow, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into darkness above her head. Tapestries hung from the walls, their rich colors muted by age in the dim light of scattered torches, depicting scenes of battle and hunt that seemed to watch her passage with the eyes of long-dead heroes. The floor beneath her feet was polished stone, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, and Catherine found herself walking more quietly than necessary, as if the very air demanded reverence. At the far end of the hall, a fire burned in a hearth large enough to roast an entire ox, its flames casting dancing shadows that made the tapestried figures seem to move and breathe. Before the fire stood a single chair, high-backed and carved from dark wood. And in that chair sat the man she had traveled so far to meet. Alexander Patel rose as she approached, his movement fluid despite the weight of the mail shirt he wore beneath a simple black tunic. He was taller than Catherine had expected, with the lean build of a man who had spent years in the saddle and on the training ground. His face, when the firelight revealed it fully, bore none of the terrible scars or supernatural beauty the stories had described. Instead, Catherine found herself looking at features that might have been handsome in a conventional sense, but for the carefully controlled expression that revealed nothing of the man behind them. His dark eyes studied her with the same dispassionate attention she had seen him give the courtyard stones. measuring and cataloging without betraying any hint of what he found worthy or wanting. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of wind whistling through the fortress walls. Catherine had rehearsed this moment during her long journey, had prepared speeches that seemed eloquent and persuasive in the privacy of her own mind. Now, faced with the reality of Alexander Patel's presence, those carefully crafted words seemed to crumble like autumn leaves, leaving her with nothing but the raw truth of her desperation. She spoke her name first, her voice steadier than she had expected in the vast space of the hall. Catherine Jackson, daughter of Nathan Lee, sister to Sharon Mitchell, come to petition for marriage to the lord of this fortress. The words felt strange on her tongue, formal and archaic, as if she were reciting lines from one of the old ballads her mother had sung. Alexander listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, giving no indication of whether her petition was welcome or merely another tedious repetition of requests he had heard and refused countless times before. When Catherine finished speaking, the silence returned, heavier now for having been broken. Alexander moved to a side table where a pitcher of wine waited beside two silver cups, his movements deliberate and precise. He poured wine for both of them, the dark liquid catching the firelight like liquid ruby, and offered Catherine a cup with a gesture that managed to be both courteous and completely impersonal. She accepted the wine with hands that trembled slightly, whether from cold or nervousness, she could not say. The wine was better than any Catherine had ever tasted, rich and complex with flavors that spoke of distant vineyards and careful aging. She sipped it slowly, conscious that this might be the finest thing she would ever experience, regardless of how her petition was received. Alexander drank as well, his eyes never leaving her face, studying her with the intensity of a scholar examining a particularly interesting manuscript. When he finally spoke, his voice was deeper than Catherine had expected, carrying traces of an accent that suggested education in distant courts and cities. He asked about her family, her circumstances, the chain of events that had brought her to his gates. The questions were direct but not unkind, delivered with the same neutral courtesy he might show to any petitioner seeking his aid or judgment. Catherine answered honestly, describing the failed harvest and mounting debts, her father's failing health and her sister's uncertain future. Alexander listened to her tale without comment or visible reaction, his face maintaining the same controlled expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts or feelings. When Catherine finished speaking, he set down his wine cup and moved to stand before the fire, his back to her as he stared into the flames. The silence stretched again, and Catherine found herself studying the line of his shoulders, the way the firelight caught in his dark hair, wondering what thoughts moved behind that carefully maintained facade. The rejection, when it came, was delivered with the same courteous formality Alexander had shown throughout their brief interview. He spoke of her courage in making the journey, of the honor she did him by her petition, of his regret that he could not provide the solution she sought. The words were kind enough, but they carried the finality of a door closing, the sound of hope dying in the vast emptiness of the great hall. Catherine had expected this outcome, had prepared herself for rejection as thoroughly as she had prepared for the journey itself. What she had not expected was the way disappointment would feel like a physical weight settling in her chest, making it difficult to breathe in the suddenly oppressive air of the hall. She set down her wine cup with hands that remained steady through sheer force of will and prepared to make her graceful exit, to preserve what dignity she could from the wreckage of her desperate gamble. But as Catherine rose to leave, something in Alexander's posture changed, a subtle shift that spoke of internal struggle rather than settled decision. He remained facing the fire, but his shoulders tensed as if he were fighting some invisible battle, wrestling with thoughts or impulses he could not entirely suppress. The silence stretched between them, no longer empty but charged with possibilities neither of them seemed ready to acknowledge aloud. When Alexander finally turned to face her again, Catherine saw something different in his expression, a crack in the controlled facade that revealed glimpses of the man beneath the legend. His dark eyes held a weariness that spoke of years spent in isolation, of choices made and regretted, of walls built so high that even their builder sometimes forgot what lay beyond them. He moved closer to where Catherine stood, his steps measured but lacking the formal precision he had displayed earlier. He spoke again, his voice softer now, asking questions that had nothing to do with marriage proposals or family circumstances. He wanted to know about her journey, whether she had traveled alone, what she had seen along the road to his fortress. The questions seemed random at first, but Catherine began to sense a pattern in them, a careful probing that suggested Alexander was trying to understand something about her that went beyond the simple facts of her petition. Catherine answered his questions with growing curiosity, describing the merchants and pilgrims she had encountered, the stories they had told about the cold night in his fortress. She found herself speaking more freely than she had since arriving, her natural intelligence and observational skills emerging as Alexander's questions drew her out. She mentioned the contradictory nature of the tales she had heard, the way fear and fascination had transformed a man into a legend, and was surprised to see something that might have been amusement flicker across Alexander's features. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Catherine had expected from their meeting. Alexander spoke of the burden of reputation, the way stories could trap a person as surely as any prison, forcing them to live up to expectations that bore no resemblance to reality. He described the parade of women who had come to his gates, each one seeking not a husband, but a prize, a conquest that would elevate their status or solve their family's problems. The bitterness in his voice when he spoke of these encounters suggested wounds that had never properly healed. Catherine found herself responding with unexpected honesty, admitting that her own motives were hardly pure, that desperation rather than affection had driven her to his gates. But she also spoke of the questions that had haunted her during the journey, the wondering about what kind of man would choose solitude over companionship. What pain might drive someone to build walls around their heart as well as their home? Her words seemed to strike something in Alexander, causing him to study her with renewed intensity. The fire burned lower as they talked, the flames settling into steady warmth rather than the dramatic leaping that had characterized the earlier evening. Catherine found herself relaxing despite the strangeness of her situation, drawn into conversation with a man whose reputation had made him seem more monster than mortal. Alexander proved to be intelligent and well-read, with insights into human nature that came from years of observation rather than participation. He spoke of books and philosophy, of the loneliness that came from being surrounded by people who saw only what they wanted to see rather than what was actually there. As the evening progressed, Catherine began to understand why Alexander had refused so many other petitioners. The women who had come before her had approached him as supplicants seeking favor, their desperation making them willing to promise anything, become anything, if only he would accept their suits. They had seen him as a solution to their problems rather than a person with problems of his own, a prize to be won rather than a man to be understood. Catherine's own desperation was no less real than theirs, but it was tempered by curiosity and a genuine desire to understand the man behind the legend. She asked about his travels, his experiences in distant courts and battlefields, the events that had shaped him into the person he had become. Alexander answered some of her questions and deflected others, but Catherine could sense that her interest was different from what he had encountered before, less calculating and more genuinely engaged. The conversation might have continued indefinitely, but the late hour and the emotional weight of the day eventually took their toll. Catherine found herself fighting to keep her eyes open, the warmth of the fire and the rich wine combining with exhaustion to make consciousness a struggle. Alexander noticed her fatigue and summoned servants to prepare quarters for her, his manner once again formal, but lacking the coldness that had characterized their initial meeting. As Catherine was led from the great hall, she found herself looking back at Alexander, who had returned to his chair before the fire. He sat staring into the flames with an expression she could not read, but something in his posture suggested that their conversation had affected him as much as it had her. The last thing Catherine saw before the servants closed the hall doors behind her was Alexander raising his wine cup in what might have been a salute or simply a thoughtful gesture, his face lost in shadow and firelight. Catherine's chambers in Alexander's fortress were more luxurious than any room she had ever occupied, with tapestries covering the stone walls and a fire burning cheerfully in a hearth carved with intricate designs. The bed was large enough for 3 people, piled high with furs and woolen blankets, that promised warmth against the mountain cold. A servant had left a basin of heated water and soft towels, luxuries that spoke of consideration for her comfort, despite the uncertain nature of her welcome. As Catherine washed away the dust and fatigue of travel, she found herself replaying every moment of her conversation with Alexander, searching for clues to his true nature beneath the carefully controlled exterior he presented to the world. The man she had spoken with bore little resemblance to the cold knight of legend, showing flashes of humor and insight that suggested depths hidden beneath his reputation for cruelty and indifference. Yet she could not forget the finality in his voice when he had rejected her petition, the practiced ease with which he had delivered what was clearly a familiar refusal. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams filled with contradictions and impossibilities. Catherine found herself wandering through endless corridors, searching for something she could not name, pursued by whispers that spoke of choices and consequences she did not understand. She woke several times during the night, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings and the strange quality of silence that seemed to permeate the fortress walls. Morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through the narrow windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air like tiny spirits celebrating the dawn. Catherine dressed carefully in her best gown, knowing that this day would likely bring her departure from the fortress and her return to the impossible situation awaiting her at home. The honey cakes Sharon had packed for her journey remained untouched in her traveling bundle, too precious to consume when their sweetness would only emphasize the bitterness of her failure. A servant arrived with breakfast, simple fare but well prepared, and served on silver plates that reflected Catherine's face like distorted mirrors. She ate mechanically, her mind occupied with planning the journey home and the conversation she would need to have with her father about alternative solutions to their family's crisis. The options remained as limited and unpalatable as they had been before her journey, but at least she could say she had tried something extraordinary, even if it had ended in predictable failure. The summons to meet with Alexander again came as Catherine was preparing to depart, delivered by the same elderly servant who had taken her horse the previous evening. His manner remained professionally neutral, giving no indication of whether this second meeting represented hope or merely a final courtesy before her dismissal. Catherine followed him through corridors she had not seen the night before, past rooms whose purposes she could only guess at, until they reached a smaller chamber that served as Alexander's private study. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their leather bindings creating a tapestry of brown and gold that spoke of learning and contemplation. Maps covered a large table in the center of the room, showing regions Catherine had never heard of, marked with symbols and notations that suggested extensive travel and careful study. Alexander stood with his back to the door when Catherine entered, examining a particular map with the focused attention of a general planning a campaign. When he turned to greet her, Catherine saw that the controlled mask he had worn the previous evening had been replaced by something more complex and difficult to read. His dark eyes held a mixture of uncertainty and resolve that suggested he had spent the night wrestling with decisions of his own. He gestured for Catherine to join him at the table, his movements lacking the formal precision she had observed before, as if some internal struggle had disrupted his usual careful composure. The conversation that followed was unlike their previous exchange, marked by long pauses and careful consideration of words that seemed inadequate to express the thoughts behind them. Alexander spoke of loneliness and duty, of the weight of expectations that had shaped his choices for so many years that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to choose freely. He described the fortress not as a home but as a prison he had built around himself, walls that protected him from the world but also prevented him from truly living in it. Catherine listened with growing understanding, recognizing in Alexander's words echoes of her own trapped circumstances, the way external pressures could narrow life's possibilities until only the most desperate choices remained. She spoke of her own situation with renewed honesty, admitting that marriage to him would solve her family's problems, but might create new ones for both of them. The admission seemed to surprise Alexander, as if he had expected her to maintain the pretense that affection rather than necessity had brought her to his gates. The morning sun climbed higher as they talked, its light gradually filling the study with warmth that seemed to encourage greater openness between them. Catherine found herself describing her dreams for a different kind of life, the education she had given herself in secret, the questions about the world that no one in her village seemed interested in exploring. Alexander responded by showing her some of his books, volumes of philosophy and natural science that opened windows onto ways of thinking Catherine had never encountered. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger, a young man whose mud-splattered clothed, exhausted horse spoke of urgent news delivered at great speed. Alexander read the message with growing tension, his face darkening as he absorbed whatever information the parchment contained. When he finally looked up from the letter, Catherine saw fear in his eyes for the first time since their meeting, a vulnerability that made him seem suddenly more human and accessible. The message brought news that would change everything, though Catherine did not understand its significance at first. Alexander's expression grew grim as he read, his knuckles whitening where he gripped the parchment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Catherine's stomach clench with apprehension. Raiders had been spotted in the valley below, he explained, armed men whose banners bore no recognizable heraldry, suggesting they were mercenaries or brigands rather than soldiers in service to any legitimate lord. The fortress had weathered such threats before, Alexander assured Catherine, his voice regaining some of its earlier control. The walls were strong, the garrison well-trained, and supplies sufficient to withstand a lengthy siege if necessary. But the timing of the raiders' appearance, so soon after Catherine's arrival, suggested possibilities too dangerous to ignore. Word of her journey might have reached the wrong ears, marking her as a valuable hostage or bargaining chip in whatever game the raiders intended to play. Catherine felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, the understanding that her choices had consequences extending far beyond her own fate. She had come to the fortress seeking a solution to her family's problems, but her presence might now endanger the very man she had hoped to marry. The irony was not lost on her that desperation had driven her to a place of safety only to bring danger with her, like a plague carrier spreading infection wherever she went. Alexander moved with sudden decision, calling for his captain of guards and issuing orders with the crisp efficiency of a man accustomed to command. The fortress would be secured, patrols doubled, and preparations made for the possibility of attack. Catherine would be given a choice, he told her, speaking with a formality that had been absent from their earlier conversations. She could remain within the fortress walls, protected but essentially imprisoned until the threat passed, or she could attempt to leave immediately, escorted by a small guard who would try to see her safely beyond the raiders' reach. Neither option appealed to Catherine, both representing forms of retreat that went against every instinct she had developed during her difficult life. She had not traveled this far and risked this much to run at the first sign of danger, nor did she relish the prospect of cowering behind stone walls while others fought battles that might have been triggered by her presence. There had to be a third choice, some way to face the crisis that did not require her to abandon either her mission or her self-respect. The sound of horns echoing across the valley interrupted Catherine's thoughts, their harsh notes carrying news that made Alexander's jaw tighten with controlled anger. The raiders were not content to remain at a distance, probing for weaknesses or negotiating for tribute. They were advancing toward the fortress with the confident stride of men who believed they held some advantage, some knowledge or weapon that made them bold enough to challenge one of the most formidable strongholds in the region. Alexander excused himself to oversee the fortress defenses, leaving Catherine alone in the study with her thoughts and fears. She moved to one of the narrow windows and looked out over the valley, where she could see dust clouds marking the raiders' approach. The sight filled her with a mixture of terror and fascination, the same emotions she had felt when watching thunderstorms approach across the fields of her childhood home. Danger was coming, inevitable and unstoppable, but there was a terrible beauty in its approach that commanded attention despite the fear it inspired. The afternoon passed in a blur of activity as the fortress prepared for siege. Catherine found herself assigned to help in the kitchens, where servants worked with grim efficiency to prepare food that could be stored and rationed if the walls were breached. The work kept her hands busy but did nothing to quiet her mind, which raced through possibilities and probabilities like a caged animal seeking escape. As evening approached, Catherine made a decision that surprised even her. Rather than accepting either of the choices Alexander had offered, She sought him out in the Great Hall, where he was meeting with his officers to plan the fortress defense. Her interruption of the military conference drew sharp looks from the assembled men, but Catherine pressed forward with the determination that had brought her this far. She proposed a third option, one that had crystallized in her mind during the long afternoon of waiting and worrying. If the raiders had come because of her presence, she would use that fact as a weapon rather than a weakness. She would present herself at the gates not as a hostage to be traded, but as bait to draw the raiders into a trap. The plan was dangerous and required perfect timing, but it offered the possibility of ending the threat without a prolonged siege that would cost lives on both sides. Alexander's initial reaction was everything Catherine had expected, a flat refusal delivered with the authority of a man accustomed to having his decisions obeyed without question. But as she outlined her reasoning, explaining the tactical advantages her plan might offer, she saw his expression begin to change. The military mind that had earned him his reputation was engaging with the problem she had presented, evaluating risks and benefits with the same careful analysis he brought to any strategic challenge. The debate that followed involved not just Alexander, but his entire war council. Men whose experience in battle lent weight to their opinions about Catherine's proposal. Some argued for its merits, seeing the potential to turn the raiders' expectations against them. Others warned of the risks, the ways the plan could go wrong and leave them worse off than before. Catherine listened to the discussion with growing understanding of the complexities involved in military decision-making, the way seemingly simple choices could have far-reaching consequences. The final decision came as dawn broke over the valley, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed to mock the grim business of war preparation. Alexander had spent the night in consultation with his officers, weighing Catherine's proposal against more conventional defensive strategies, searching for the approach that offered the best chance of protecting both his people and his unexpected guest. The choice he made would define not only the immediate crisis but the future relationship between them, assuming they both survived to see what that future might hold. Catherine waited in the Great Hall as Alexander delivered his decision, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation that made it difficult to stand still. The plan they had developed together was audacious in its simplicity, relying on the raiders' assumptions about her value and vulnerability to draw them into a position where the fortress's advantages could be brought to bear. Success would require precise timing, absolute trust between people who barely knew each other, and a measure of luck that no amount of planning could guarantee. The morning sun climbed higher as final preparations were made, each detail checked and rechecked by men who understood that small oversights could have fatal consequences. Catherine found herself at the center of activity that felt both urgent and dreamlike, as if she were watching someone else prepare for a desperate gamble while she observed from a safe distance. The reality of what she was about to attempt seemed too large to grasp fully, like trying to hold an ocean in cupped hands. Alexander sought her out as the appointed time approached, his manner formal, but carrying undertones of something deeper and more personal than military courtesy. He spoke of duty and honor, of the obligations that bound them both to see the plan through regardless of personal cost. But Catherine heard other meanings in his words, acknowledgments of connection and possibility that neither of them was ready to voice directly. The conversation felt like a farewell and a beginning simultaneously, marking the end of one phase of their relationship and the potential start of something entirely different. The walk to the fortress gates felt longer than any journey Catherine had ever undertaken, each step carrying her further from safety and closer to a confrontation that would determine not just her own fate but the lives of everyone within the fortress walls. The guards who accompanied her moved with professional efficiency, but Catherine could see the tension in their faces, the understanding that they were about to attempt something unprecedented in their experience. The gates opened with the same groaning protest they had made upon Catherine's arrival, but now the sound seemed ominous rather than welcoming, like the creaking of a gallows tree in the wind. Beyond the threshold lay the valley floor, where the raiders waited with the patience of predators who believed their prey had no choice but to come to them. Catherine stepped through the gates with her head held high, conscious that she was crossing a threshold from which there might be no return. The raiders' leader emerged from their ranks as Catherine approached, his bearing suggesting confidence born from years of successful intimidation and violence. He was younger than she had expected, with the kind of casual cruelty that came from never having faced consequences for his actions. His eyes assessed Catherine with the calculating gaze of a merchant evaluating goods, and she felt her skin crawl under his scrutiny even as she maintained the appearance of calm resignation. The negotiation that followed was a careful dance of words and implications, each side probing for advantage while maintaining the pretense of civilized discourse. The raider leader spoke of terms and conditions, of the price that would secure Catherine's safe passage and the fortress's continued existence. Catherine listened with growing understanding of the man's psychology, recognizing the blend of greed and arrogance that made him dangerous, but also potentially predictable. As the conversation continued, Catherine began to implement the subtle signals that would coordinate her actions with the fortress defenders. Each gesture and word had been planned in advance, designed to convey information while maintaining her cover as a helpless victim. The raiders watched her with the casual attention of men who saw no threat in a single woman, their confidence making them careless in ways that more experienced soldiers would never permit. The moment of truth came sooner than expected, triggered by the raider leader's growing impatience with negotiations that seemed to offer no immediate profit. His hand moved toward his sword with the lazy confidence of a man who had never met serious resistance, and Catherine knew that the time for words had passed. The plan she and Alexander had developed was about to face its ultimate test, and success or failure would be measured in heartbeats rather than hours. What followed happened with the compressed intensity of a lightning strike, violence erupting from apparent calm with shocking suddenness. Catherine's signal brought arrows from the fortress walls, precisely aimed shots that took the raiders centuries before they could raise an alarm. The trap she had helped design closed around the enemy with mechanical precision, turning their assumed advantage into a deadly liability. The battle was brief but decisive, the raiders' overconfidence proving to be their downfall as they found themselves caught between Catherine's position and the fortress defenders, who emerged from concealed positions throughout the valley. Alexander led the charge with the controlled fury of a man defending something precious, his sword work displaying the skill that had earned him his reputation on distant battlefields. In the aftermath of victory, as the last of the raiders fled or surrendered, Catherine found herself standing in the valley where her desperate gamble had played out with consequences she was still struggling to comprehend. The morning sun that had witnessed the battle's beginning now illuminated a landscape transformed by violence, where the peaceful approach to Alexander's fortress had become a testament to the thin line between civilization and chaos. Bodies lay scattered across the ground that had seemed so serene just hours before, and Catherine felt the weight of her role in their deaths settling into her bones like winter cold. Alexander approached her across the battlefield, his armor stained with blood and his face bearing the grim satisfaction of a man who had protected what mattered most to him. But when his eyes met Catherine's, she saw something beyond military triumph, a recognition that their shared experience had forged a connection deeper than either had anticipated. The woman who had arrived at his gates seeking a marriage of convenience had become a partner in battle, someone who had risked everything, not for personal gain, but for the protection of others. The conversation they shared as they walked back toward the fortress was conducted in the hushed tones appropriate to a sacred space, their words carrying weight that went far beyond their literal meaning. Alexander spoke of courage and sacrifice, of the way Catherine had transformed herself from petitioner to warrior in the space of a single day. Catherine responded with observations about leadership and trust, about the way desperate circumstances could reveal character in ways that years of ordinary life might never accomplish. As they passed through the fortress gates, Catherine realized that she was no longer the same person who had approached them 2 days earlier. The desperate daughter seeking salvation through marriage had been replaced by someone who understood her own strength and worth, who had discovered that survival sometimes required becoming more than circumstances seemed to allow. The knowledge sat strangely in her chest, like a bird learning to use wings it had never known it possessed. The celebration that evening was subdued, marked more by relief than triumph, as the fortress inhabitants gathered to acknowledge their deliverance from a threat that could have destroyed everything they had built. Catherine found herself at Alexander's side during the festivities, no longer a supplicant seeking favor but an honored guest whose actions had earned her a place at the high table. The transformation felt surreal, as if she were living someone else's life while her own continued in some parallel world. But it was the private conversation that followed the public celebration that truly changed the course of Catherine's future. Alexander led her back to his study, where maps and books waited with the patience of old friends. And there, among the accumulated wisdom of ages, he made her an offer that had nothing to do with her original petition. He spoke not of marriage born from desperation, but of partnership built on mutual respect and shared experience. The proposal Alexander presented was unlike anything Catherine had imagined when she first approached his gates. He offered her a choice rather than a solution, an opportunity to build something new rather than simply escape something old. She could return to her family with gold enough to solve their immediate crisis, her debt to them paid, and her freedom secured. Or she could remain at the fortress, not as a wife taken from necessity, but as a partner chosen from preference, someone who had proven herself worthy of trust and capable of growth. Catherine's response came not from desperation, but from hope, not from the need to save her family, but from the desire to save herself. She had discovered during her brief time at the fortress that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined, that her mind and spirit were resources as valuable as any dowry she might have brought to a conventional marriage. The choice Alexander offered represented not just security, but possibility, the chance to become someone she had never dared dream of being. The letter Catherine wrote to her father that night was perhaps the most difficult communication she had ever attempted, trying to explain decisions that seemed to defy every expectation of duty and propriety. She told Nathan of the gold she was sending, enough to clear their debts and secure Sharon's future, but also of her decision to remain at the fortress as Alexander's partner rather than return home as his rejected petitioner. The words felt strange beneath her pen, describing a life that seemed too extraordinary to be real. Sharon's response, when it came weeks later, carried the joy and wonder Catherine had hoped to see. Her sister's natural intelligence, allowing her to understand what their father's more conventional mind struggled to accept. The gold had indeed solved their immediate problems, but more importantly, Catherine's example had shown Sharon that women could choose their own paths even when circumstances seemed to offer no alternatives. The lesson was worth more than any inheritance, a legacy of possibility that would shape Sharon's own future choices. As winter gave way to spring in the valley below Alexander's fortress, Catherine found herself settling into a life that bore no resemblance to anything she had previously imagined. Her days were filled with learning and growth, as Alexander shared his books and maps, his knowledge of the wider world, and his understanding of the responsibilities that came with power and position. She discovered that her mind, starved for intellectual stimulation during her years of simple survival, absorbed knowledge with the desperate hunger of someone making up for lost time. The marriage, when it finally took place, was a celebration rather than a transaction, witnessed by people who had come to respect Catherine for her own accomplishments rather than simply accepting her as Alexander's choice. She wore her mother's silver cross with pride, understanding now that Dorothy Reed's legacy was not one of romantic foolishness, but of courage in the face of impossible circumstances. The quiet woman who had approached the castle gates seeking salvation had found something far more valuable, the knowledge that she was capable of saving herself. The story of the cold night and the quiet woman who melted his frozen heart became legend in the villages below the fortress. But those who lived through the reality knew that the truth was far more complex and beautiful than any tale could capture. Catherine Jackson had not changed Alexander Patel through love or magic, but through the simple act of seeing him as he truly was rather than as legend had painted him. In return, he had offered her the same gift, recognition of her worth that allowed her to recognize it in herself. Years later, when travelers asked about the transformation of the cold night, Catherine would smile and speak of choices and chances, of the way desperate circumstances could become doorways to unexpected futures. She had approached Alexander's gates carrying nothing but hope and determination, and had discovered that sometimes those simple gifts were worth more than all the gold and glory the world had to offer. The quiet woman had found her voice, and in doing so had helped a lonely man remember his own.